Hey, my name is TJ. I'm a person in long-term recovery. For me, that means I haven't had a drink or a drug since August 9th, 2016. I'm here hosting the Recovery Matters podcast with...
Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen Matos. Thanks for having me, TJ. I'm a person in long-term recovery. And for me, that means I haven't had a drink or a drug since October 1st, 1986. And the other parts of my recovery, I haven't placed a bet since August 15th, 1987. And I'm also a person impacted by gambling, having a family history of it, growing up with it, and how it affected my life. Another big part of my story.
Do you want to kind of jump into what life was like for you growing up?
So as I mentioned, I was a person, affected by gambling, and my dad was a gambler. I grew up in Hartford, all over Hartford, the North End, South End, lived in the projects. My father, he was a bookie, a card shark, hustler. That was his job. He didn't have any other job but doing that. Mm-hmm. He made his living off of gambling. And back then, that was a long, there weren't any local casinos back then. If you wanted to go to a casino, you had to fly to Vegas or go to Atlantic City. So most of the gambling was all done in social clubs, bookie joints type places, card games. Card games. At social clubs, stag parties, clam bakes. So that's how my father made a living, and he was very good at what he did. And it wasn't a lot of it wasn't even gambling, because him and his crew were like hustlers. So they'd go in and they'd grab they could get all the money the way they knew what they were doing. They were called mechanics. They were like really good with a deck of cards and other things, dice, and so they'd go in and get all the money. But on the other hand, my father, even though they won money that way, he would still like to play the horses and bet sports. So things he had less control over, where that was a gamble, where the other things weren't really gambling. They were like stealing. Things. So anyway, so those kind of things both went on, for many years. And growing up, certainly I didn't understand a lot about it. But what I did see was there was my mom, my younger sister, and myself, where there was a lot of turmoil in the family. Like my mother and father fought a lot over, probably because of my father's lifestyle. There was some arguments, some domestic violence. I can remember my sister and I being really scared and not really knowing what was going on. We really didn't know. And as we got a little older, all our vacations were always in August in upstate New York, next to Lake George, because next to Lake George was Saratoga Racetrack. So, all our vacations had to be around gambling, gambling venues. And as we got older, my father would take us on vacation to the Bahamas, where there were casinos there. And so everything, gambling was enmeshed in everything. If my father did good, we all did good at home. Like, if we got presents on Christmas and our birthdays if he made a score winning, and if he didn't, we waited. And then the other thing with that is, I didn't understand it back then, but we moved around a lot. I went to 3 elementary schools, like 2 or 3 middle schools, a couple, like we moved a lot. And I'm looking back, I realize what that was now, because the rent was never paid, because money was for gambling, not for expenses, like household expenses. If there was extra money, maybe something would get paid. But my father and the people he hung with, everything they did was like a scam. Like how so long as they could get away with it, they would continue. So again, not realizing what it was at the time. So again, having that family history. My father was incarcerated as a result of his gambling activities, his bookmaking activities, and so that's kind of how it went, through my, early years, teenage years, and even, going to high school. My father actually, he put me in a good high school. I went to a private school in West Hartford.
Wow.
I was very fortunate. I didn't want to go, but he had one good thing he did was he said, "You're not going to school with all your loser friends in New Britain." So he actually won a lot of money, and he paid for, at one time, and he paid for my private school in West Hartford. So just a little sidebar, one of the funny things was, everybody that I went to school with, their parents were doctors, lawyers, they owned businesses, restaurants, they were all very wealthy. So when they'd ask me what my dad would do, and I would like, well, I don't know what to tell. I would tell my dad, what do I tell him? What do I didn't know what to say. I was, and he said, "Oh, just tell him I'm in the car business or whatever." But it was just funny because I didn't know what to say, and I knew, because I was older and I kind of understood more, and and I was at the age then too. It was like, I never said, I'm never going to gamble. I remember 16 kind of what it did. I said, I'm never going to do this. And through my teenage years, I mean, I used alcohol and drugs. It wasn't a daily thing. I wasn't growing up in a time where there was, keg parties and pot. There was some chemicals, we would try. It wasn't a daily thing, but, it was more like we went to a concert or on a weekend, those type of things. So it wasn't a really daily thing. But the one thing I do remember is the very first time I drank, I got drunk. I mean, I was 13, and it was like a whole bottle of, Boone's Farm. That's what everybody was drinking back then. Got really sick and really drunk, and I did it again a week later or 2 weeks later, whatever it was. So it wasn't, and I got in trouble. The first time I drank, I got in trouble, got in an argument with my friend's father. It was silly.
Was it love at first sight with drugs and alcohol?
No, it wasn't. It just, we did it. It was like, it was like, it was a initial good feeling, but then it was really sick after that. And it was just kind of the environment we grew up in. It was kind of peer pressure. Then the pot came in, and kind of like, there was a couple friends might have had older brothers that were like, Woodstock age, and I'm just only a year or two under that, but they were into all that stuff. So some of that stuff would filter down to us, but it wasn't a daily thing. But we took chances with some of the things that we did, party, and we're lucky, I made it out of those years. And so kind of fast forward, I went to that good school, but the only thing really difference there was there was richer kids with better drugs.
Yeah.
It's like, there was no difference really. I mean, I'm grateful for the education I got. I don't know how I made it out of there, but I did. Oh, and then, I graduated from there. I was going to go to college, but then I got a really good job with the state of Connecticut.
Nice.
The Department of Transportation. And so I moved out. I was 18. I moved out on my own. And so one of the things that happened shortly after that, and I was making a lot of money, but at the time the state didn't pay that well, but I had good benefits. I'd work a lot of overtime. So one of the things that, if you have a family member that gambles and they need money, the first place they're going to go is to another family member. So that's kind of what was happening. And my mother went through it. I remember that. My mother, my father borrowing money from my mom or taking money from my mom, whatever you want to call it. And then my father would start calling me on payday. Hey, I need to borrow some money. And, I get paid every 2 weeks. There was no cell phones back then. He'd call me at work in the office. And I'd go down and I'd give him some money. And, I'd give him a lot of money, like sometimes like 3/4 of my paycheck. Don't worry, you get it back tomorrow, whatever. And I would do that and not get paid back, and then,
of course,
I was living with my girlfriend, and it was starting to cause problems in my relationship because I was loaning him money. And then it graduated from me taking out loans for him, signing for loans, and not getting paid, which it was hard to say no to my dad, right? How do you say no to your father? Like, you trust him, the person you're supposed to trust most in life, and I'll pay you back, make sure. And then I take out a loan, another loan, and then next thing you know, my wages are getting garnished.
Yep.
So it was, and then that kind of caused a breakup I allowed it to cause a breakup of my relationship. And nothing I could do. I had a lot of anger and resentment towards that, but there was really nothing I could do.
Yeah.
So then, kind of fast forward a little bit, I got into another relationship. I met a nice woman, a girl. I was young. I was still young. I was probably only 22, 21, 22. And we got engaged to get married, and had a big stag party. And my father, one of the things he did was he always ran the gambling at all the stag parties with his crew, no matter what stag, whoever. That was their way. They made money, and they'd do their hustle and their card playing. So, this is just a little side story, but it's going to lead into something else.
Okay.
And it's the reason why I mention it. At my stag party, my father and his crew robbed all my in-laws and their relatives at the card games of over $20,000. And this is like in 1981. So that was a lot of money, right? And it was all cash. Her family was in they were Greek, and they all owned pizza restaurants. They were all in that business. And so they dry cleaned them all. And wow. So needless to say, and I knew nothing about it. Like, hey, I didn't know, I figured my father would they wouldn't do anything like that. They just said they were going to run the wheel and whatever. I didn't know they were going to go crazy like that. And so next thing you know, that some of the money wasn't going to be paid by some of her relatives. Like, they found out who my dad was, and there was some phone calls made, and the money was paid, and so that caused a lot of bad blood, like going into my marriage. So anyway, needless to say, my marriage didn't last long, 6 months.
Okay.
Because of the friction that it caused between my father-in-law, and then that rolled down to my wife, and that really hurt me, though. I mean, I was really devastated over the loss of this relationship, because it was a real serious relationship. I wouldn't have got married if I didn't love her. And that loss of that relationship really, that's when I really turned to alcohol. And that's
Okay.
why I told that story, because it was such a devastating loss. I was really upset. I was distraught. I moved in with some friends. I started drinking every night, drinking. It was just the one,
Yeah.
that's what I did. Got involved in some cocaine.
Okay.
So that's when my drinking really accelerated, and my drug use started getting a little more. And about the same time, I still had some debt, I was gambling. My father called me up at work one day and said, I have a couple horses. Maybe you can, get some extra money, pay some of your bills with these horses I got. So he called me, and this was at the office at work. Again, no cell phones back then. This is like 1978, 79. This is around 1980, around there, somewhere around there. And 81, I think it was. And I went down there. He says, how much money you have? And I said, I have $10. And I gave him the $10. He bet the horses. It was a daily double, the last 2 races. And I didn't, it won, right? So, and these were 2 long shots each. So daily doubles where you pick the winner of 2 races in a row.
Okay.
And depending on the odds of the horses, depending how big so for that $10 bet in like 1981, it was $2,000. I don't talk about money usually, but I just talk about this time because it was a big win at a young age. And so certainly having that was another like risk factor for me. So it was like, wow.
That's the thing with problem gambling, right? Is people who typically have that first big hit.
Yeah, it
leads
can be
into.
Yeah, so I had a lot of risk factors going for me. I had a family history.
Okay.
I had some substance use background now that I
Yep.
was working on, and then having that big win, like really first time out. I mean, I bought a lottery ticket now and then back there, but nothing like it was not a priority. But
Yep.
this was a big win, so I was like, wow. It took a little pressure. I could pay some bills, but then I saved a chunk of that money. I want to know more about this horse thing, right? So,
Yeah.
so I started going down OTB after work every day, hanging out with my dad. It was kind of a way to reconnect with my dad. He taught me how to read the racing form, and I was studying that. It was like learning all about the horses. And my father was really good at handicapping. He was very, very good at it. The only thing is he could win a lot of money, but then he would gamble money like on other things, betting sports back then, so he would lose it on sports. But and I was actually pretty good at it myself. I could find some winners, long shots, but then again, once I won, it was like now I can bet the way I really want to bet,
Yeah.
And then not always win, and then would lose. But anyway, so it started, accelerating the gambling. I was gambling every day. I didn't drink every day, but I gambled every day. I was gambling every single day, and even when I wasn't gambling, I was thinking about gambling. I would, just keep the horse. I only bet the horses they ran from 1 o'clock to like 5:30.
Okay.
I had a boss that played the horses, so if I couldn't get down there with the work truck, he would get the bets in. We did have online gambling back then. Actually, we had an OTB telephone account, so that was like you call up on the landline and you punch in you say your code on it, and so that was our kind of online gambling back then. So we always got our bets in, and I can remember, as the progression of the gambling was taking over, I can remember working 2 weeks I worked for the DOT and having like 80, 90 hours overtime on one paycheck and just cashing my paycheck and
Being like,
and
wow.
just put it right on the nose. It wouldn't be like, like I'm going to bet find a horse. There would be no place and show. It'd be like right on the nose, right? Just go for it all.
Wow.
And just lose it all. And wait 2 weeks again, beg, borrow, and steal to kind of make it to the next 2 weeks, but it didn't matter. And that was like the progression too with gambling. It starts out with small bets, then the more frequent, then the preoccupation, and then larger amounts to get that same effect from the gambling, because it is about that rush, that high that you get. Even betting that large amount, you just lose the value of $1, whatever it meant. So, and then I still was drinking, as I mentioned. So when I didn't always lose. So if I did win, sometimes go out and buy a lot of drugs. Like cocaine was very expensive in the 80s, and I don't even know what it is now, but certainly go and get a lot of drugs and drinking all night. And my drinking was mostly from Thursday to Sunday. And I couldn't drink. I didn't drink or drug at work because I had a job to do. But would call in a lot on Friday, like half the garage would already. And it was a lot of people would party at work, and there was always someone worse than you that kept the heat off the next guy. So it was like, but anyway, I was closely becoming to the top of the heap, and so certainly one by one people were getting sober. And
So so you get your paycheck, right? You cash and you bring it all down to the track and you bet it all on that one big thing and you lose. Like, isn't that kind of like the same feeling with like that coming off of that high?
It is. It is. It's very. But then the only thing that gives me hope is figuring out I got to get some more money so I can be in action the next day. So
Okay.
immediately shifting gears, like who can I borrow money from? Where can I get some money? Where can I get some money? Because knowing that little bit of hope that I can win it back. I'll win it
Okay.
back. The next race or tomorrow, whenever it is, I'll get this money back. I'll be someone. I get a $20 bill from them, and I'll be back in action. And having that hope is what got me through. Because
Yep.
other than that, it would be really devastating.
Yeah.
Just so and then like I said, the substance use, was really taking over. The drinking. I can remember I'd be at one of the bars on Broad Street in New Britain. I used to joke I didn't have enough hands. I'd have a cigarette hanging out of my mouth. I'd have a drink in one hand. There'd be lines in front of me, and I'd have a racer form in the other hand. It would be like everything all at once.
Yep.
That's how it was. Missing work, and I had a great job. I had been there 10 years at the time until finally, the drink had started rolling into Monday, Tuesday,
Yep.
Wednesday. There was no space in between anymore. So when that happened, I remember not calling into work and for 3 days, and I got really scared. My car broke down on New Britain Avenue in Hartford.
Okay.
I was, after a 3-day bender, I had a dollar, I think, in my pocket. I got a bus from New Britain Avenue to Twin City Plaza in Newington, and I had to walk home the rest of the way from New Britain. It was like a 2-mile walk, and I remember that 2-mile walk was like the worst. Like that was my bottom. Like my whole life flashed before my eyes. Like I can't live like this anymore. I just can't live like this. And I remember that, praying to God, please help me. I can't do this. And I got home. I was living with my mom at the time. I told her. I called a friend of mine, and they said, okay, I'm going to take you to an AA meeting that night, and so
Wow.
they took me to an AA meeting that night, and so I was very grateful for that. And and I never been to an AA meeting. I went to this AA meeting, and it was a place called the Dungeon. It was in Bristol, whatever meeting that was that night, some church in Bristol.
Yep.
And it was a speaker discussion meeting, and this guy told his story. He had been sober. I still remember it to this day. This was 38 years ago, and he shared how he was 5 years sober, but he had 50 detoxes. He lived in dumpsters, and I'm so grateful by the grace of God that I didn't say, "Well, I'm not as bad as him." I said, "Man, if he could do it, I could do it." That was my mindset. And so far to this day, one day at a time, I haven't had to pick up a drink. And so I went to
Wow.
my boss. I told my boss the next day. I called him up. He said, "Come on in." So they called employee assistance. They hooked me up with an IOP 3 nights a week. There was another gentleman that got sober at my job a year before. He was a heroin addict. He drank a little bit. He was very well known at Hartford, and he took me to meetings every single night. He saved my life. His name was Jay. I honor his memory every day. He passed away, 18 years ago, but
Yep.
he took me to meetings every day. We talked about sobriety at work. I went to IOP. I was going to IOP 3 nights a week and going to AA 4 nights a week. I was doing really good,
Wow.
sobriety-wise. But I was still doing one thing. What was I doing?
Gambling.
Gambling, yeah. So I would talk about, they talk about IOP. What do you do for hobbies? What do you do for fun? Right,
Yeah.
the usual stuff, right? I said, I like the horses. That's my hobby. Oh, really? And they didn't know anything about gambling, but they could see how,
Yeah.
they could just see how I was, and I talk about it. Clearly, they could see that it was a problem. So, but they didn't push it, So I finished IOP, was going to, AA every night. I was working every day. I was feeling better physically because I wasn't using, but I was still gambling every day.
Okay.
And with that gambling, it really wasn't a recovery lifestyle. I wasn't being truthful about where I was going, where my money was going, wasn't paying bills, starting to miss some work again to go to the track.
Yep.
Didn't pay my taxes, and it was really causing a lot of problems to the point where I almost drank again as a result of gambling. Thank God I didn't, but that really scared the heck out of me because I knew if I did, it was all over. And there was someone in my home group, AA group at Hardware City, who had, he was 5 years sober and he had a year in Gamblers Anonymous, and he would always share that, like what gambling did to him after 5 years of sobriety and how he almost drank. So I reached out to him. He took me to my first Gamblers Anonymous meeting. at the St. Thomas Seminary, over 37 years ago, and that's where that's how I was able to stop gambling.
Wow.
I really, but I just want to, and I'm going to just talk about the third part of my recovery. I talked about as a person affected. So as I mentioned, I had a lot of anger towards my dad, about the stuff I went through growing up. My younger sister, she had a lot of, I don't know what, she had a lot of issues, had a lot of mental health challenges. I don't know if it had to do with the family life growing up, but she also had, alcohol and drug addiction, pretty severe. So when I went to Gamblers Anonymous, I shared a little about my story, and they said, well, maybe you belong in the next room. And the next room was Gambling and that's for the family members. So I was so mixed up and so confused. I had my own gambling. Yeah, I was so impacted by my father's gambling. I could have cut myself in half and been in both rooms. But it was kind of like triage. I had to address the problem at hand.
Yep.
I had to get a handle on the gambling. I had to stop gambling. Gamblers Anonymous back then wasn't the most warm and fuzzy place. Okay. I had a little thick skin for being in AA for about 9 months at the time. So I went to a pretty hardcore place. I used to go to Hardware City Group. I used to go to St. Elizabeth House on Sunday morning with all those old timers from Park Street, real hardcore sobriety. So I had some thick skin when it came to recovery, and I listened, and there was a lot of old school gamblers there. I was the youngest guy in the room at 29 years old.
Yep.
And there was all old timers in there. Some of the guys where he gambled with my dad, but it was hardcore. I did what they said. But even with that hardcore, there was a message of hope there. One of the things that really resonated with me at one of my first meetings was an old timer there. He said that everything he tried to get by gambling, he now has today by not gambling. And that really stuck with me, because I always thought I had to win to get everything I needed in life, because that's how I was brought up. That's how my dad lived. And so, kind of fast forward, I went to GA every Friday night, for many years. I still go to GA, after all these years, and I still go to AA. So, recovery it was a process, though. It was a lot. I had, it was a lot of good things. I quit smoking right when I stopped gambling. The hard part was learning how to manage money. I never paid a bill on time. I didn't know how to manage money. Money had no value, so I had to learn that. It was a process,
Yeah.
So learning that. And just kind of paying my bills on time, paying my taxes, getting caught up with the IRS, and it was a lot, and but it was good. And thank God for AA as well. I was very active in AA. I was active in GA, and recovery's been good. I've never stopped going to meetings. I love meetings. It's my core values, my way of life. I certainly, not everybody's way to get sober, but it is, and not for gambling, but it is for this recovery person. And again, I did go to Gambling meetings because I had to take care of that side of the street as well. It was very difficult, very, very difficult with that anger and resentment I had towards my dad. And, the first couple of years of recovery from gambling, I couldn't even hang around my dad. I couldn't talk to him.
Yep.
He would want me to come to the coffee shop next to OTB. Hey, you don't have to gamble, right? I said, if I come down here, I'm going to gamble. And I know I would. And so then I would talk to him on the phone. He'd want to talk about how his day went at the track. I said, listen, I can't have this conversation. So I kind of had to sever my relationship from my dad for almost 2 years.
Wow.
It was like self-preservation, really. And, going forward, learning, I guess he got the message, learning how to manage that. And and then, the steps certainly were very helpful, making amends, because, one of the things with gambling, the 12 steps, it talks about making a moral inventory. Well, with gambling, making that moral and financial inventory. So being accountable for any debts that I have, making a list of who you owe and how to do that. And, even though my dad, I had a strained relationship with my dad, and he put me through a lot. I mean, I did a few things to try to even the score, and I had to learn how to take care of my side of the street. And so thank God through my own recovery, we were able to kind of mend that relationship. And, he passed away on my 5-year anniversary of gambling, but but everything that needed to be said was said. So, and I credit, the programs, my AA and GA programs were helping me with that. And, and now, recovery's been good. After 15 years of sobriety, I have a beautiful daughter. I have an old dad with a young daughter, and
nice.
It's been great. It was a real transitional event in my life. It was like that spiritual awakening that that I've had, and I'll talk about my work in a little while if you want to ask me about what I do. But
I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, and so one of the things with my work, after I retired from the state of Connecticut after 37 years, I had a great career there. I started working. I had the opportunity to work as a peer counselor in problem gambling. At the Better Choice programs. that they have. Connecticut has some of the best gambling treatment in the country. So I didn't know anything about it. They said, you just have to be in recovery. I went and interviewed, and I wound up getting this position as a peer counselor, and based on my lived experience. So,
Yep.
And one of the first trainings they sent me to was CCAR.
Wow.
They put me in Recovery Coach Academy,
Yep.
and that was really eye opening for me. I plugged for CCAR, but it was really beneficial. When I went, because when I came in, I was totally 12-step oriented. That's all I knew, abstinence based. And so when I was working with these people, some of them were kind of in the harm reduction mode. Some of them, not everybody wanted to go to 12-step meetings. Some of them had a bad experience. So the number one thing I learned, especially going to CCAR when I came in, was that multiple pathways of recovery was huge.
Okay.
Helping me embrace, not everybody's like me, And so I was in recovery 25 years at the time, so I was totally, all in for that. But
yeah,
learning this whole other world was very important, especially in the field I was working in. So
that's really
very,
cool.
very grateful for that, and many other trainings. So I do work with persons, affected from problem gambling. I work with their family members, and
Wow.
Just a sidebar. My work gets really busy, and I always say my job is not my recovery, but it has been helpful because one of the things I will say, giving back has been a big part of my job. Even though it's in the capacity of my job, sometimes it takes me to places that I mentioned having, being in recovery. We have these little moments of clarity or spiritual awakenings along the way that are really, enlightening and make us feel good. So, I dealt with a lot of stuff with my dad. This is a really important part of my story because it was really cathartic for me. I've been to counseling, countless times, been to Gam-A-Non, and it's a lot of hard work on the other side of the fence too, managing all that stuff that I went through. And then one day I was facilitating, this was probably about a year into my work, and back at the time, there was two peer counselors. This was like, sometimes we had a peer-led gambling treatment group, and so the other person was out, and she had been there for a couple of years. So this was like the first time of myself doing a group, and I was kind of really nervous, like, oh my God, like I'm doing this treatment group. There's like 13 people in there, and I'm sitting there, and I'm waiting for it to start, and I'm like, how the heck did I ever get here? Like in that moment, like in this seat that I was in that moment.
Yeah.
Like, how did you, whatever gave you the wherewithal or to get to this spot where you could help all these people, right? And I just had that moment of clarity where I looked up and said, thank you, Dad. So it was like, if it wasn't for him and all the stuff that I went through, I wouldn't have what I have today. So it was just turning it around. And so that's another kind of moment of clarity or spiritual awakening type of thing. And really, working in recovery has really helped me personally as well. So
that's really cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm glad you had that experience and shared that experience.
Yeah, it's really,
So one of the things you said that's really sticking out to me is Connecticut has some of the best treatment for problem gambling. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So one of the things, Connecticut, when I got into the field in 2013, I remember being in GA, early on, and there was these guys in GA. They carried pagers, and they were like peer counselors. This was like in the 80s, like late, early, late 80s, mid, like I came in 87, so this was around that time. And they said, oh, they work on a helpline or something, and they work in gambling. I didn't know anything about it. There was a couple guys. So coming into the field, Connecticut has had peer counselors since the 80s in gambling. And that was the treatment. The state would hire these persons with lived experience to work in gambling. And so it was amazing that they did it, way back then. That's almost 40 years ago. So
wow.
Fast forward to today, they probably had about the Better Choice programs came about 30 years ago. They came in, the state turned it over to, they put a bid out, for the different regions of DEMIS to bid on these Better Choice programs. So there's 5 Better Choice programs in Connecticut, and that's BETTOR, as in bed or,
Yes.
So we have 5 Better Choice programs in Connecticut. They're well staffed. We have gambling trained clinicians. We have peer counselors. I'm very fortunate in mine. We provide more services. We have some extra grants. So I was able to hire, 3 more peer counselors, recovery coaches. We send them all to Recovery Coach Academy and Recovery Sports Specialist training. Lived experience is a big part. Having people with lived experience is a huge part of our work because what do we offer? hope, right? That's
Yeah.
the number one thing I always say. I'm the hope salesman, right? Right? So we are, right?
Yeah, I love it.
So when they come in, they're
Mhm.
devastated. When they say they owe a lot of money, in
Yep.
their mind, the problem could be the solution, right? One more bet's going to get me out, so
Yep.
we have to help them with that. Kind of been there and done that, and
Okay.
so again, the Better Choice programs and there's we have support groups. We have long-term recovery group, early recovery group, a women-specific support group, and
Okay.
a family support group. This is at my program. All of them have at least one recovery group. We have 4 at mine, and our biggest support group to this day, and our best attended support group today, is our family support group, and it's mostly there's a couple spouses, but it's mostly parents of young gamblers that are gambling, on all these new apps and sports betting, and they're
Mhm.
calling up, devastated after they bail their college age, person. They're mostly male. There's some, and numerous times to realize that that's not working anymore.
Yeah.
We need help, and so we have a support group, to help them through that process to help their loved one and their own recovery. So it's really important that we offer that. And again, I get to facilitate that with my own lived experience. And again, yeah. So I've been doing, actually, I started the family support group over 10 years ago, and it was peer-led then, because back in the day, our Better Choice People programs, were
Mhm.
the people would come in for help. Their treatment was all grant funded. There was no
Okay.
out-of-pocket expense. But now with the Affordable Care Act, mostly everybody has insurance. So we do bill insurance.
Mhm.
And if they don't have insurance, or their insurance doesn't cover gambling treatment, most of them do. There's a couple that don't. Our grant will cover their treatment. And if there is a big copay on their insurance and they can't afford the copay, our grant will cover the copay, because
Wow.
it's set up that way because we don't want money to be a barrier to treatment, because chances are they're not coming in because they're doing well, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we have really good, there's no other model like ours in the country. And, we're funded, we get pretty decent funding to do what we do. We make the money we get go a long way.
Mhm.
I have an additional grant, recovery support grant. I do a lot of outreach with that. As you know, I go to all the
Yes.
CCARs mostly every month. I do a lot of outreach in the community. Sometimes people don't want gambling treatment, right? They don't want to go to, so I provide resources for them, other recovery resources, whether it's GA, Gam-Anon, CCAR,
Yep.
those type of programs, or they just want to talk to someone.
Mhm.
And so we provide resources for that. Another cool thing that we have for folks in recovery from gambling, or their persons affected from it, we offer scholarships for recovery coach training if they want to get more involved. We have scholarships for Recovery University, recovery sports specialist training.
Yep.
We have a speakers bureau. We help people, tell their story, craft their story, because a lot of folks in recovery from gambling or infected from gambling, they don't have a lot of opportunities to tell their story. And
Okay.
they have a good story to tell. They want to share their experience. And we know how important that is, giving back and helping one's recovery. So
Yeah, that's amazing. Let me ask you. So I got 2 more questions for
Sure.
you. One of them that I was thinking about, if somebody calls that number, the problem gambling line, what does that experience look like for them?
So I don't work the helpline. I have worked it in the past, but
Yep.
Connecticut Council on Problem Gambling, they're right across the hall, all right?
Yes.
So they have a 24/7 helpline. I think it's one of the best helplines in the country, personally.
Okay.
For most of the time, it's staffed with someone with lived experience.
Okay.
Okay, they do have folk, with gambling. Most of the time, if not, they have a clinician or prevention specialist that's working it. So most of the time, it's those, and so they're really competent people that work the helpline. So it is 24/7. Someone calls, the person on the phone, kind of find out where they're at, what kind of services they're looking for, see what their needs are, kind of talk, they listen to them
Yep.
and see what they're willing to do. They'll explain to them if they do want help. They'll say they're in my region in Western Connecticut. They'll be offered treatment. Here's the information for that treatment program. In turn, we'll get an email from them saying, we just got a call from so and so. This is where they're at. Can you give them a call? So we make sure that they're not lost in the shuffle.
Yep.
And then after we make contact, we let them know that we made contact with that person. They have a tracking form, so make sure no one falls through the cracks.
That's
So
really
that's
good.
how it comes from the helpline. So the helpline, and maybe they just want some recovery resources. Brian and Val are the other recovery folks that do that. They can provide that for them.
Mhm.
If they want some more GA information, they'll hook them up with me or Gam-Anon. And, maybe I'll meet them at a meeting if they wanted someone to meet them at a meeting. I've done that.
That's
Or
really
maybe
cool.
I'll email them some resources or give them some more information about other types of recovery, CCAR, those things. So yeah. And then sometimes they're self-referred. They can go on our website. They can find it. Or they know somebody. Sometimes we get referrals from clinicians and things like that. So we get multiple different ways, but the helpline is one of the main ones.
Okay, that's really cool. Thank you for that. I just wanted to kind of bring that stigma down, especially around calling that and letting people know what that experience is like. And my last question for you, if somebody came in here in their first 24 hours of recovery, what's the best piece of advice or support that you could give them?
I knew you were going to ask me that, and I thought
Yes.
about that for some because I watched your podcast, right?
Okay.
So when someone comes in first time to my program, I always say my lived experience is my number one tool that I have to help somebody. So I kind of listen to them and then share a little bit about myself to qualify myself as a person in recovery and maybe use part of my story, how it kind of connects with some similarities and kind of, again, be the hope. We got to offer them that hope, right?
Yes.
These are some of the things that I did to help me through this. And this is what's available to you. And if, here's some of the options. Is this something that you would want to try? Because I try not to, tell them what to do, but want to offer them options.
Yep.
And so kind of find out where they're at. And I think, just sharing a little bit of our lived experience breaks the ice, makes them more open. You know that.
Oh,
It
yeah.
makes them more open and to want to talk more, and then asking those follow-up questions. And, and then I always say kind of on the sidebar, if you share enough and you make that good connection, when they say to you, well, you know what I mean, but then
Yeah.
you got them, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah, it makes them feel really engaged and like that.
Yeah.
There's that connection there.
yeah, you mentioned the word stigma too. Just want to really quickly, I want to
Please.
mention that.
No,
'cause,
please talk about that.
yeah, one of the things we see in gambling, there's a lot of shame and guilt associated with the gambling disorder. It's maybe not as accepted as other addictions. Thank God in Connecticut, we do a lot of outreach and prevention, so we talk about it more, but there's still pockets of where people don't realize, we still hear the term degenerate gambler, right? We used to hear the term junkie every day, right?
Yes.
Thank God we don't hear that. It's all the advocacy and it's affected everybody. Well, now, the degenerate gambler, that we still hear that term today, sometimes not as much, but and it just the view of people that think that gamble. So they're don't want to talk about it. They're afraid, they're embarrassed to talk about it with someone else, or a family member might know what's going on and they're afraid to ask for help because they're embarrassed. So that's a huge thing, that stigma. And along with that stigma, gambling has the highest rate of suicide out of any addiction. Approximately 1 in 5 persons with a gambling disorder will attempt suicide. So, and again, a lot of that's connected with that shame and guilt, the hidden nature of the addiction. You can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't test for it.
Yep.
So it can go on, for a long time. And just quickly on the stigma, I'll just share my own story with that. So I was in this field, I was in recovery for 25 years before I came work in this field. Everybody knew I was in AA. Everybody knew I used to drink. We all know people that are sober and don't, whatever. It's like not a big deal anymore. Pretty mainstream, right?
Yep.
So, but gambling recovery, I didn't talk about a lot. I had my GA, my little GA group, a couple close family members, and I remember, and I have my coins on my keychain. I have my Gamblers Anonymous coin and my AA coin. I can remember being at a school event for my daughter, and she was like, I don't know, 8th grade or whatever it was. I left my keys on the chair with my 2 coins on there. So I'm walking out and my daughter's teacher picks up, she's like, oh, you forgot your keys. And she's waving my keys. And I'm like, oh my God, she's going to see my Gamblers Anonymous coin, right? I was like mortified, she's going to know I'm a compulsive gambler. I didn't care about the AA one, but you see, even after 25 years of recovery, I kind of felt some embarrassment over that. And even another thing, just quickly, when I retired from the state and I started working in this field, people say, oh, what do you do now? I said, I work for I was working for the Connection at the time.
Okay.
I work for the Connection. Well, what do you do there? Well, I'm a case manager. Well, for what? Like, well, I work in this treatment program. Well, what kind of treatment? Then I say, well, gambling. Well, how do you know about that, right?
Yeah.
So then I'm like, because I didn't want to, they're asking me all these questions. I didn't want to tell them because I got to tell them I'm in recovery from gambling. So, I mean, obviously I'm on a podcast today. I talk about it everywhere, but, when I was a newbie in the field, even after all those years of sobriety, I wasn't like, I didn't want to talk about it. Not, not other than my recovery rooms.
Wow. So there is that extra shame and guilt kind of attached to it.
Yeah.
Wow.
I felt that. Yeah.
That's pretty crazy. Yeah, I didn't know that. And like, as a person on the outside and looking in, right? Like, as a person in recovery, right? It's easy for me to like break down that barrier, right? I can make that connection with a lot of people, and like, because we understand the feelings.
Yeah.
But we look at people who don't have that experience, right? Because you talk about degenerate gambler. There's always the thing in the movie with people, and like, we're looking at it, and it's like, oh, that guy's crazy, or like that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, and he was like, I remember a few years ago working with a new person. That guy was in his 20s, right? Mm-hmm. Sports bettor, lost a lot of money.
Yep.
I met with him in a coffee shop, kind of like they had that interchange like we talked about earlier. What is something would you be willing to do to help yourself? Would you consider the treatment program? Would you, Gamblers Anonymous? And as soon as I said Gamblers Anonymous, I'm not going to sit in a room full of degenerate gamblers.
Yeah.
And here he is coming to me for help, But so I would say, well, what does the degenerate gambler look like? And I go to Gamblers Anonymous, So kind of like breaking down that barrier. But again, just someone even with a gambling disorder has that viewpoint,
of looking at it as I'm not like them, right? Yeah, that's really wild.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, dude. You're amazing. You have an amazing
Thanks for
story.
having me. This was great.
Of course. Thank you.